In 1917, the world witnessed the birth of a revolutionary new state, the Soviet Union. What began as a radical political experiment in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution would transform into one of the most powerful and influential nations in modern history. Over the next 7 decades, the USSR became a global superpower deeply involved in shaping the trajectory of the 20th century. Its rise was marked by bold industrial achievements, military might, and a vision of spreading socialism across the globe. Yet, despite its early success and ambitions, the Soviet Union's story ended with a dramatic and unexpected collapse in 1991, a moment that stunned the world and marked the conclusion of the Cold War. The rise and fall of the USSR is a story that encompasses revolution, idealism, dictatorship, and the ambitions of a nation striving to build a new world order. Founded on the principles of Marxism-Leninism, the Soviet Union was envisioned as the first socialist state with a mission to break away from the imperialist world system. Under its leaders, the Soviet Union underwent drastic transformations economically, politically, and militarily. From Lenin's vision of socialism to Stalin's iron-fisted rule, the Soviet Union became a force to be reckoned with. Its role in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II, its rivalry with the United States during the Cold War, and its efforts to spread communism made the USSR a defining force in global politics. But the Soviet Union was more than just a political and military power. It was also an ideological force, offering an alternative to Western capitalism and democracy. For millions around the world, the USSR symbolized a hope for equality, workers' rights, and the end of colonialism. However, the reality within the Soviet state was far more complex. While the Soviet Union achieved remarkable feats, such as industrializing at a breakneck pace and putting the first human in space, its people endured brutal purges, famines, and repression. The state's tightly controlled economy, excessive bureaucracy, and authoritarianism ultimately sowed the seeds of its own destruction. The Soviet Union's collapse was as swift as its rise had been dramatic. In the late 1980s, the cracks in its system became too wide to ignore. Economic stagnation, political corruption, and rising discontent among its satellite states led to a series of reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev. But these efforts to revitalize the USSR instead hastened its demise. By December 1991, the once mighty Soviet Union had disintegrated, breaking into 15 independent republics. The world's largest socialist experiment was over, and a new era began. The fall of the Soviet Union not only marked the end of an empire that had spanned 11 time zones, but it also dramatically altered the global balance of power, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape international relations today. The Russian Revolution and the birth of the USSR. In 1917, Russia was a country on the brink of collapse. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of the Romanov dynasty, ruled over an empire that was increasingly unstable, facing both external and internal crises. Russia's involvement in World War I had been disastrous. The Russian army suffered massive defeats at the hands of the Germans, and the economy was in ruins. Food shortages and inflation left much of the population starving, while corruption and incompetence in the government fueled resentment among the people. Across the empire, strikes and protests became more frequent, and the political system offered little hope for reform. By February 1917, the situation had reached a boiling point. Protests in the capital, Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, quickly escalated into a mass uprising demanding an end to the war, the food crisis, and the autocracy. The February Revolution succeeded in toppling the Tsarist regime. Under pressure from the masses and his own government, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. In his place, a provisional government was established, led by moderate politicians who aimed to create a parliamentary democracy. However, the new government failed to address the pressing issues of land reform, economic hardship, and peace. Instead of withdrawing from the war, the provisional government continued to fight, deepening the crisis. As the months passed, discontent grew and more radical forces began to organize for a second revolution. In October 1917, the political landscape in Russia shifted dramatically. A radical socialist faction known as the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized their moment. Unlike the provisional government, the Bolsheviks promised immediate peace, land redistribution, and power to the workers and peasants. On October 25, 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks launched a coup, storming the Winter Palace and seizing power in Petrograd. This Bolshevik Revolution, also known as the October Revolution, was a watershed moment in world history, marking the beginning of a new era. The Bolsheviks set out to build the first socialist state, where the working class would rule and capitalism would be abolished. The revolution, however, was just the beginning of the challenges that lay ahead. Lenin's government faced fierce opposition from various factions, including royalists, liberals and socialists who opposed the Bolsheviks. What followed was a brutal and bloody civil war between the Bolshevik Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik White Army, which was supported by foreign powers, including Britain, France, Japan and the United States, all of whom sought to crush the new communist government. The civil war devastated Russia, leading to widespread destruction, famine and millions of deaths. Yet, despite the odds, the Bolsheviks managed to emerge victorious by 1922. That year, Lenin and his comrades established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, encompassing Russia and neighboring territories like Ukraine, Belarus and the Caucasus republics. The USSR was born out of revolution, war and radical ideology, setting the stage for its rise as a global superpower over the next century. Lenin, Stalin and the Soviet experiment. Under Lenin's leadership, the Soviet Union was established as a socialist state with the goal of building a classless society. The government seized control of industries, redistributed land and nationalized key sectors of the economy. Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in the 1920s, which allowed for some private enterprise to rebuild the war-torn economy. However, Lenin's death in 1924 left a power vacuum in the Soviet leadership. It was Joseph Stalin who would emerge as the new leader of the USSR, and under his rule, the Soviet Union would undergo drastic changes that would shape its future. Stalin abandoned Lenin's NEP and pursued a policy of rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. Stalin's economic plan, known as the Five-Year Plans, transformed the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse in a remarkably short period of time. Massive state-run projects built factories, railroads and cities, propelling the USSR into the ranks of the world's industrialized nations. But this rapid development came at a high human cost. Stalin's reign of terror. Joseph Stalin emerged as the leader of the Soviet Union following Lenin's death in 1924. And over the next 2 decades, he would transform both the Soviet economy and society through a series of radical and brutal policies. One of the cornerstones of Stalin's agenda was the collectivization of agriculture. In the late 1920s, Stalin ordered the creation of state-run collective farms known as kolkhozes, where peasants were forced to surrender their privately owned land, livestock and equipment to the state. The goal was to increase agricultural productivity and eliminate the kulaks, wealthier peasants who were viewed as a threat to socialist ideals. However, collectivization had disastrous consequences. Widespread resistance from peasants led to violent reprisals, and the forced requisition of grain left millions of people starving. The most severe famine occurred in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, where millions perished in what is now recognized as the Holodomor, a man-made famine that remains one of the darkest chapters of Stalin's rule. Stalin's approach to governance relied not only on economic policies, but also on fear and repression to maintain control. While the collectivization effort ravaged the countryside, Stalin turned his focus to eliminating any potential threats to his power within the Communist Party and the wider Soviet society. In the mid-1930s, he initiated a campaign of political repression known as the Great Purge. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, conducted a series of show trials where top party officials, military leaders, intellectuals and ordinary citizens were accused of treason, sabotage or counter-revolutionary activities. The accusations were often based on fabricated evidence or forced confessions obtained through torture. The purges, which lasted from 1936 to 1938, decimated the leadership of the Red Army, weakened the Soviet bureaucracy and created a climate of terror throughout the country. Stalin's regime operated on the principle that anyone, even those within the Communist Party, could be an enemy of the state. The show trials, broadcast to the Soviet public, were intended not only to eliminate Stalin's real or perceived rivals, but also to send a clear message: absolute loyalty to Stalin and the party was paramount. Those who were tried and convicted, often on trumped-up charges, faced execution or were sent to gulags, brutal labor camps located in remote regions of the Soviet Union. The Gulag system became a defining feature of Stalin's rule, with millions of prisoners subjected to hard labor under inhumane conditions. Historians estimate that during the Great Purge and subsequent years, between 700,000 to 1.2 million people were executed, while millions more were imprisoned or exiled. The purges, while devastating, served to consolidate Stalin's unchallenged grip on power. By the end of the Great Purge, Stalin had cemented his control over every aspect of Soviet life. The purges eradicated any dissent within the Communist Party and eliminated the old Bolshevik Guard, leaving Stalin as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. The paranoia that had gripped the country during the purges became a hallmark of Stalin's reign, as citizens lived in constant fear of denunciation or arrest. At the same time, Stalin maintained a personality cult, presenting himself as the father of the Soviet people and the architect of the country's progress. Under his rule, the Soviet Union would continue to industrialize rapidly. But the human cost of Stalin's policies, through famine, repression and terror, left deep scars on Soviet society that would persist long after his death in 1953. In 1941, the Soviet Union faced one of its gravest existential threats: Nazi Germany's invasion of Soviet territory under Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's armies advanced rapidly, capturing vast swaths of Soviet land and threatening the very heart of the USSR. The initial stages of the invasion were catastrophic for the Soviet military, which was caught off guard and ill-prepared. In the first few months, millions of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded or captured, and cities like Kiev and Minsk fell to the Germans. Despite these early losses, the Soviet people showed incredible resilience. Civilians were mobilized to fight on the front lines and to relocate industries far behind enemy lines to sustain the war effort. This spirit of sacrifice and determination, combined with Stalin's orders to defend Soviet cities at all costs, would prove pivotal in the long and bloody war that followed. Two critical battles defined the Soviet Union's fight for survival: the Siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Stalingrad. The Siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days, from 1941 to 1944, during which time the people of the city endured extreme starvation and relentless German bombardments. Yet Leningrad never fell, becoming a symbol of Soviet endurance. The Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943, marked a major turning point in the war. Stalingrad was reduced to rubble in some of the fiercest urban fighting of the war, but the Soviet Red Army managed to encircle and defeat the German Sixth Army, forcing a surrender that shattered Hitler's ambitions of conquering the Soviet Union. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not only a strategic military win, but also a profound psychological blow to the Nazi regime, signaling that the tide of war had turned in favor of the Allies. By 1945, the Soviet Union had transformed itself from a nation on the brink of destruction to a victorious superpower. The Red Army's push westward, culminating in the capture of Berlin, decisively ended Nazi Germany. But victory came at an immense cost. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, both soldiers and civilians, lost their lives during the war. Nevertheless, the war had fundamentally reshaped the USSR's global standing. The Soviet Union occupied much of Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments in countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, effectively creating a Soviet sphere of influence that would endure for decades. The end of World War II also set the stage for a new geopolitical struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States, two competing superpowers with opposing ideologies. This conflict, known as the Cold War, would dominate global politics for the remainder of the 20th century, with the USSR now positioned as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. The Cold War and the space race. Throughout the Cold War, the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States dominated global affairs. While the two superpowers never engaged in direct combat, they competed fiercely in ideological, military and technological arenas. The Cold War era saw the world divided into two blocks, one led by the capitalist West and the other by the communist East. The Soviet Union expanded its influence by backing revolutionary movements and communist regimes in Asia, Africa and Latin America, while the United States supported anti-communist forces around the globe. One of the most significant dimensions of this competition was the space race. The Soviet Union scored a major victory in 1957 when it successfully launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. 4 years later, the Soviet Union achieved another historic first when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, cementing Soviet dominance in the early years of space exploration. These achievements demonstrated the Soviet Union's technological prowess and were a source of immense pride for the regime. However, the space race was just one aspect of the Cold War. The Soviet Union also sought to maintain military parity with the United States by developing nuclear weapons, leading to a dangerous nuclear arms race. At the height of Cold War tensions, events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Yet, despite these conflicts and close calls, the Cold War remained a war of ideology, diplomacy and influence, with both superpowers vying for dominance without engaging in direct military confrontation. Economic stagnation and Gorbachevs reforms. While the Soviet Union had achieved remarkable successes in space exploration and military power, its economic system was beginning to falter by the late 1970s. The centrally planned economy, once hailed for its rapid industrialization, had become inefficient and stagnant. Soviet factories were plagued by outdated technology, low productivity, and poor quality goods. Citizens experienced chronic shortages of basic necessities, long lines for food, and declining living standards. The rigid bureaucratic system of the Soviet Union was proving incapable of keeping up with the economic dynamism of the capitalist West, particularly the United States. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that change was needed. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and he quickly introduced a series of ambitious reforms aimed at revitalizing the Soviet Union. His policies of Perestroika, or restructuring, and Glasnost, or openness, sought to address the systemic problems of the Soviet economy and political system. Perestroika aimed to decentralize economic decision-making, introduce limited market mechanisms, and improve productivity, while Glasnost allowed for greater freedom of expression and transparency in government. Gorbachev's reforms, while well-intentioned, had unintended consequences. Glasnost allowed long-suppressed grievances to come to the surface, as citizens began openly criticizing the government and demanding more political freedoms. Meanwhile, Perestroika failed to deliver the economic revival that Gorbachev had hoped for. Instead, the reforms exacerbated the existing economic crisis, leading to rising inflation, food shortages and labour strikes. The loosening of political control also emboldened nationalist movements in the Soviet republics and Eastern Europe, where communist regimes began to crumble one by one. The collapse of the Soviet Union. By 1989, the Soviet Union's control over its Eastern European satellite states was rapidly unraveling. In a series of revolutions, communist governments across Eastern Europe fell, with the most symbolic event being the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. As the Cold War began to thaw, nationalist movements gained momentum within the Soviet Union itself, with republics like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Ukraine declaring independence. In 1991, the situation reached a breaking point. A failed coup attempt by hardline communists in August 1991 further weakened Gorbachev's authority, and the momentum towards independence became unstoppable. In December 1991, Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Federation, along with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus, signed an agreement to dissolve the Soviet Union and replace it with a loose confederation known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, effectively marking the end of the USSR. The red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, signaling the collapse of one of the most powerful states in modern history. The Soviet Union had disintegrated into 15 independent republics, leaving a world forever changed. The end of the Cold War ushered in a new era of international relations, but it also left a legacy of political and economic challenges that would shape the future of the post-Soviet states for decades to come. Legacy of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War, but the legacy of the USSR continues to reverberate throughout the world. The fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union paved the way for new democratic governments. But the transition was fraught with difficulties. In Russia, the 1990s were marked by economic chaos, political instability and rising crime, as the country struggled to shift from a planned economy to a market-driven one. Former Soviet republics faced similar challenges, with many experiencing ethnic conflicts, authoritarianism and economic hardship. Today, Russia remains a powerful player on the world stage, though it has redefined itself in the post-Soviet era. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, Russia has sought to regain some of its lost influence, both within the former Soviet sphere and globally. The legacy of the Soviet Union is also evident in the continued tensions between Russia and the West, as well as the unresolved conflicts in regions such as Ukraine and Georgia. Despite its collapse, the Soviet Union's achievements in areas like science, technology and education remain points of pride for many. The Soviet Union was a superpower that shaped the 20th century, and its influence is still felt today in politics, culture and international relations. While the experiment in communism may have ultimately failed, the USSR left an indelible mark on the modern world, from the structure of global geopolitics to the struggles for independence in its former territories. As the world continues to grapple with the legacy of the Cold War and the Soviet era, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union remains one of the most defining events of the 20th century.